Welcome to the History Bards Historical Movie Reviews. It's movie time starting in 4, 3, 2, 1. With your hosts, Michael Zucker and Dee Marley. Today's movie review, Lawrence of Arabia, directed by David Lean.
It's just so deep on so many levels. And I know, probably most people don't relate directly to what he went through of, learning you're a sadomasochist and things like that.
Yeah.
But the portrayal of, I think, miscommunication between different layers of a person's thought, between having an interpretation of yourself on a conscious level versus either suppressed or just not fully understood, a deeper sense of self on a lower subconscious level, and the miscommunication and the importance of understanding both in order to kind of achieve a level of mental health and inner peace or anything like that. This film captures that brilliantly and is something that anybody can relate to and learn from.
Yeah. And isn't that, because I know we've kind of talked about that before, about that level of literary excellence that and not all historical fiction leans that way, but I really enjoy that. I really enjoy that whenever there's a historical fiction novel that leans towards those literary devices. You almost to be able to have your character come out in that way, as far as the depth and the layers. And then by the end of the novel, for your reader to connect on such a grand scale. And that's exactly what this movie does. You are connecting with this character on such a grand scale, and everything about the movie is grand, from the cinematography to the character arc to the story to but it's almost like because a lot of people don't like literary books, and so I think that's the reason why I said that about not everybody likes Lawrence of Arabia, because not everybody likes that kind of depth in a movie.
To me, I also think I think Lawrence of Arabia is a type of art that I guess there's kind of two extremes within art. On the one hand, there's kind of popcorn storytelling.
Right.
I'm not going to name names, but everybody can think of very kind of simple forms of storytelling that are mass market appeal and everybody can enjoy, but it's not as meaningful. And on the other extreme, there's concepts of this is not the nicest term, navel gazing almost, of it's meant to be so deep that the very intellectual type of people can be it's so profound. And I might be sounding a bit like that in this, but to me, I think Lawrence of Arabia is actually more toward the middle in that, maybe leaning a bit more toward the intellectual side. But something like Lawrence of Arabia or The Godfather, to me, are still very mainstream films. They're not super, the type of film that only real kind of intellectual film nerds, not to be mean, but that type of demographic. It is a mainstream classic.
Yeah.
But so it kind of is able to operate within both, where it has elements that are inviting for, I think, the average viewer, but it also has a level of depth that can be enjoyed by more thoughtful viewers.
It kind of makes me think of the same kind of, I felt that way about East of Eden. Because for a lot of people watching that movie, they may not get it, but there is such character arc and everything else about that movie and about the book, especially the book. That's one of my favorites. So I get what you're saying about.
Well, I think there's a difference between. We talked about The Great Gatsby last week, I think.
Yeah, we did.
Sorry.
That's okay.
We talked about The Great Gatsby last week, and I would say that's closer to where Lawrence is.
Yes, it is.
Whereas and I'm not trying to pick on this book or this author because everybody knows it's, you know, among the greatest of all time, but like something like Ulysses, I think, is on more toward an extreme end where it's written in a way that's more meant to be like dissected by scholars in a way than it is to be entertaining for like average, even like intelligent or well-educated average people. But it's not, that's not really the audience it's aiming for in the same way. Whereas The Great
Yeah, I agree.
Gatsby or the works of Hemingway, where it still is literary fiction, it still is, you know, like very sophisticated, but it's also written in a way to be more accessible to like the average person.
Yes.
I think Lawrence of Arabia or The Godfather or a lot of what we consider, you know, kind of like the great classics are able to exist within that middle ground.
Yeah, I agree.
What else should we? Oh, I was actually going to ask, since I know that you're, you know, very sort of that Shakespeare is one of your favorite,
yes,
you know, authors.
obviously everybody knows that.
Yeah. That's, you know, that's a lot of your reference point for historical fiction and storytelling. Let me just ask this: like, do you see any resemblances between Lawrence and, let's say, a character like Hamlet?
Well, of course, the tragic figure and everything. Yeah, I can because, you know, Hamlet was, to me, searching for his place.
Yeah.
And he was in the midst of all of this turmoil, just like Lawrence was in the midst of all of that turmoil and everything. So I can definitely see a comparison of the figures and the arc because, you know, Hamlet went through trying to understand who he was in the whole grand scheme of things, just like Lawrence did. And then it ends tragically. And, you know, and the similarities that Hamlet had to his uncle and trying to deal with, hey, you know, he has some of the same kind of ambition that his uncle did. Well, I go to the extreme, you know, that he went to in order to gain what I want. So it's and having to deal with that to, you know, come into that understanding. So definitely there is similarities between those two characters.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two, maybe the two, like, you know, have psychologically rich
Yes.
characters, at least that I can think of, and virtually anything, either, you know, of any artistic medium. Also, I mean, this is a more superficial point, but I feel like the most famous images of both characters are fairly similar, of Hamlet holding the skull and Lawrence holding up his large knife, kind of looking at himself.
Oh, yes.
Both when he initially dons his Arabic outfit on the route to Aqaba, and then later after the massacre, where he's all bloody and looking at himself again in the knife, kind of seem like, you know, different parts of his character arc and how he's changed.
Yeah.
But, you know, those two images of the skull and the knife are just, I don't know if David Lean and Peter O'Toole had that in mind when they
I'm sure they did. They had to have.
We should touch on briefly, just like David Lean's experience with this. That because it took, I think, about 15 months of footage to shoot this in the desert, and then I think they went to Spain and England to shoot some of the final shots. But so 15 months in the desert, that people, I think, within the cast were saying like David Lean was almost resembling, you know, like, you know, an Englishman who goes to the desert to stick it out for months and months on some great ambitious project, you know, just suffering through the pain of it all. That he was almost becoming Lawrence to some extent. And this was kind of crazy to read about, that David Lean refused to wear like protective goggles through that entire experience. And so he actually had grains of sand like embedded into his eyelids that had to be taken out with surgery.
Oh my goodness. I had never heard that. Wow.
Talk about like suffering for your art.
Yeah, it is kind of like, you know, we ask, or as historical fiction authors, we always like to go to the places and experience that so that we can write about it accurately. So yeah, that's really, he definitely went all out, didn't he?
Who do you think is the main antagonist of the film?
Oh, himself.
Himself. I think there's a couple of other. I mean, that's very likely. I mean, for tragedies, that's usually a good answer.
Yeah.
But I think there's a couple other options that I've been thinking about. I think one answer, and this might sound a little, I don't know what you would call it, like too literary of an answer, but like the Arabian Desert
Oh, yeah.
of, and this kind of notion of like the entire film is he wants to build a self-image for himself by, quote unquote, like conquering Arabia or something like that. Like he
Yeah.
tells Dryden at the beginning, like it's going to be fun, that type of thing.
Yeah. And I
It'll
think that's
become,
what he felt like one of the reasons why he started feeling so invincible, because
yeah,
he was able to go across those deserts, when the Bedouins, they lived
yeah,
there. They experienced it every single day, so they knew. And
yeah.
here comes this Englishman, this pale Englishman who is, I'm gonna do it. So
Yeah, I love what Aldi says. He's like, "You're mad."
yeah, he's
When talking
mad.
about crossing the desert.
Yeah,
Yeah, but so that's what he wants to do as part of like his arc is to like, achieve a self-identity, become the sun god by conquering the desert.
yeah.
But then it's like the desert conquers him and
Mhm.
sort of teaches him who he really is, and he doesn't like who he is.
Yeah,
And so it's almost like the real struggle is between Lawrence and
yeah,
Arabia wins.
yeah.
Um,
That's really good. That's really good to um that's a very good point. Bringing that out.
some other antagonists. One who I think gets overlooked, I just mentioned him, is Mr. Dryden, who is played by Claude Rains. He's the Arabic Bureau. Like he's a fictional character, but he's meant to represent the Arabic Bureau.
Yeah.
And then he says that's who he works for. So it's this, I think it was either like a diplomatic or military sort of unit established to direct sort of the British Foreign Office's political goals as part of the Middle East campaign. And we keep talking about how that Lawrence doesn't understand who he really is, and at the beginning of the film, nobody seems to really know who he is.
Mm-hmm.
I think my theory is that Dryden is like the one person who sees through him from the beginning and
Yeah.
gets who he is and how he can be used to knock out the Ottoman Empire so Britain can take over the Middle East.
Yeah.
And so he's using Lawrence like a pawn the entire time. And then as soon as he gets what he wants, he just discards him and sends him back to England.
Yeah.
And it's fairly ruthless.
Yes.
It's devious. It's a case where the villain wins or the antagonist wins.
Mm-hmm.
And he's not just doing that, he's quite nasty about it. There's a great scene in the second half where he just sort of mocks him.
Yeah.
Where I think where Lawrence learns about the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and he says something to the effect of, there might be honor among thieves, but there's none among politicians.
Right.
And instead of like feeling bad about it, which General Allenby seems to,
He
at least to
seems
some
to, yeah.
extent, that Dryden more just throws it back in his face and says, I'm trying to remember the exact line, where like, yes, I lied, but you half lied. And those of us who lie merely hide the truth, whereas those who half lie don't know where you put it, or it's something to that effect.
Yeah.
And just really throwing it in his face. He's the one who points out that after the Dara torture scene, that Lawrence is bleeding in the back of his uniform, which on the one hand I think symbolically represents Lawrence's mind almost coming apart, but also and is able to kind of show, that Lawrence is breaking down to Allenby and pointing that out. And then as he leaves and Bentley encounters him and says, what's going on in there? And Dryden says something to the effect of like, and now he wishes he was somebody else or something like that, which again is kind of touching on this theme of searching for
who he
identity.
was. Yeah.
So Dryden, and then the third main one would probably be the Turkish Bey, the one who captures him in Dara. There's not that much more I think to say about that segment.
Yeah, no.
We've touched on that.
Yeah. So I know from like the outset that this is going to be a 10-star for you.
Oh, I mean, this is like the definition of a 10 star for me.
Yeah,
Like
and I
this
agree
is like the
too.
type of this is like the type of standard that everything else gets compared to.
Yeah, it is, and this is a 10 star for me too. Even like this, everything about it. I'm like a huge fan of Peter O'Toole anyway.
Yeah.
It was always like extremely tragic, I guess, that he'd never won an Academy Award, and until they finally gave him like I think an
I mean,
honorary one.
do you know,
But
Tony, the reason why though he didn't win for this? Because he was
I
the
think
front
there was
runner.
I think there was a reason. Yeah, tell me. I
Yeah,
don't
he
remember.
was the front runner, but then when he kept meeting with like the Academy and the press and things when the movie was coming out, he was just like drunk for all of his
Oh
interviews.
yeah.
And so they were just mad at him for his like unprofessionalism. Gave it to Gregory Peck for To Kill a Mockingbird instead.
Well, come on, Gregory Peck. Okay.
No, I mean, yeah, it's not like it was, no, there was no competition, but
Right.
it's like, one of the greatest performances ever, probably my favorite performance ever. And it's just like, maybe we're not going to give it to you if you're going to behave this way.
Well, come on. I mean, yeah, he did a phenomenal job in this, but I have to defer to the Lion of Winter, his performance in Lion of Winter. You know, to me, even excels even more than his portrayal of Lawrence.
Oh,
You know, I think a lot of people, especially in historical fiction, who love that era anyway about Henry and Eleanor, he comes across as being the epitome of Henry II. That it was almost like if you think of that king, that's Peter O'Toole. And he played him in both Beckett and in the movie Beckett and in The Lion in Winter. So in both of those performances, he was definitely the king.
we should review those at some
Oh
point.
yes, absolutely.
Um,
Lion in Winter is one of my favorites. Mine and my husband's, we love that movie. I think we watch it at least one time a year.
um, a couple other things we can touch on.
And I have to say this real quick because he
Oh,
told me
sure.
to say it. So when we were given the reviews, it's 10 stars for you, 10 stars for me. And just going back to how that some people don't like this movie. Okay, so my husband said he gives it 4 stars because there was too much
Oh,
sand. He said too much sand.
this is going to be super off topic. That sounds very reminiscent. I don't know if from our younger or more science fiction fan viewers. What Anakin Skywalker says in the second Star Wars prequel, where he's like, "I don't like sand. It's
That's
coarse and rough, and it gets everywhere."
yeah. So
Um,
I think that's probably how he feels too. So
you know, even though it's the main villain, as we said, or the main antagonist, so I guess
yeah,
he's right in not
yeah,
liking it.
yeah, exactly.
One other thing, let's start with this, and then we can. We're looking to wrap this up to end
Okay,
more on a high note.
sure.
Are you wanting to keep going, or do you want to
I
wrap this up
mean,
in a few minutes?
I feel like that this can. I mean, I think we've covered a lot, don't you?
Okay. Okay, then I would like to touch on maybe two more short points.
Sure.
One is, so obviously I've said this is my favorite film, definition of a 10 star. Um, are there any weak points that you would point out or think of?
Weak points. I think it's kind of like we were saying early on. I I don't know that I liked it starting with what happens
Yeah.
to him. That I remember watching it from the very first time, feeling that way. I was like, oh well, because I know a lot of people knew the history of him, but back whenever I watched it, I think it was probably when I was in high school
Mm.
that I watched this, and I didn't really know a whole lot about him, because he's a British figure. We weren't taught about him, and at
Right.
least the school I went to, weren't taught about him. So I didn't know a whole lot about him. So for it to start that way, it kind of was like jarring, and I was like, why do I want to know that this happened to him from the very beginning? I almost
Yeah.
wish that it had built up to that. I feel like it would have. I don't know. It's kind of like, I know a lot of people are like huge Downton Abbey fans, but we got to know Matthew as a character, long before we find out what happened to him. and whenever that happened, it just was so emotionally powerful. For me, it was anyway. I know it was for a lot of fans of the show, that whenever that happened, because you had gotten to know, you went along his journey of where, and then something so tragic happened. And I almost wish, to me, that's almost a weak point, if you want to call anything in that movie weak, because everything is so powerful. But yeah, that's the one thing that stands out to me.
Yeah, the opening's not my it's not my favorite opening like in any film. Probably Godfather Part 1 would take that prize. But a couple other things that I would say, I mean, I think one reason why we keep saying, some people don't like this movie, I think the pacing is kind of slow in parts.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And I think that could have been improved a little bit. But I mean, and part of the reason I feel like it feels that way is like, I think the capture of Aqaba kind of goes into this. It takes like an hour to cross the desert, to cross the Nephut to get to Aqaba. But then capturing Aqaba is over like in a minute or two.
Yeah.
And I know like David Lean did not like filming battle sequences or action sequences. I mean, he's been quoted as saying that, but I think like for a war film, there's not a lot of like battles or action in it.
Yeah.
And if those were a bit larger, maybe like the rest of it wouldn't feel quite so slow in spots.
That's an interesting thought, because if you think about movies like Braveheart, where it's, you've got this story behind it, that leads up to the whole first part, leads up to the reason why the, how there was a reason why he suddenly changed his position of, okay, let's get rid of all of the British in Scotland. So yeah, I can see that. It's almost if there would have been a little bit more of a balance between the two. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know David Lean wanted to focus on character and not action,
Yeah.
but like a little more action might have like it's kind of what we're saying earlier. It's like there needs to be like a kind of a compromise between like entertainment and depth.
Yeah.
And too entertaining and it becomes a bit shallow. Too deep and it becomes harder to hold people's attention.
Yeah.
And so I think maybe this film leans a little heavy toward the deep side of it in that way.
I do too. So this is a good question. So I have mixed feelings about this. How do you feel like if it was ever remade?
I actually have been thinking about this. So I don't think they should remake it as a single film, would be the short version. I think the two options that I would think of is one is to basically we mentioned Lord of the Rings earlier, almost like a trilogy of epics, to kind of go deeper into like the actual political and military side of it. A lot of the characters that Lawrence actually worked with in real life and that are documented in Seven Pillars of Wisdom were removed to kind of simplify it for a single film. So I think you could go into that. The alternative would be almost like a 10-part miniseries.
Yeah. Like a Netflix.
Netflix or HBO or anything like that.
Yeah.
To kind of go more through all of this individual campaigns and everything.
That's interesting.
I don't think there's a point doing a single film though.
Yeah. So you would be okay with it? Because I don't know. I have mixed feelings about this, because there's some iconic movies that I just feel like they should not touch. Like I cannot imagine them ever remaking Gone with the Wind. I would just be really, really upset.
I'm not like advocating for them to do it. I'm just saying that like I think there's a way to do it that would be justifiable.
Yeah.
I think so. A couple other things I wanted to touch on was I think we just want to touch on a little deeper the book that this is based on, Seven Pillars of Wisdom.
Okay.
That so it's the real T.E. Lawrence's memoir of this experience. It's thought by history that he wrote it essentially as a novel, but about himself. Winston Churchill called it the greatest war epic in the English language. And And it's interesting. Apparently, Lawrence, there's letters of his when he was working on it saying that like he wanted it to be on par with Moby Dick, which he described as the greatest novel in the English language. And that it inspired one of my favorite novels, For Whom the Bell Tolls by Ernest Hemingway. That it was one of Hemingway's favorite books, and that he modeled his book to a large extent, both on Seven Pillars of Wisdom and on War and Peace by Tolstoy. So I think that's an interesting element just for the more, literary side of this. That it is a film adaptation of a book. I'll try to wrap this up. I know we're gonna forget. I think one thing that I learned recently about it that's interesting is there's a scene, I think it's in the Big Push scene, where he's arguing with General Allenby about the Damascus campaign, where he's standing in front of a mosaic, and he's saying, they'll come for me, that line. That I looked into what the mosaic is of, because I thought it was going to be of, I'm forgetting the character's name, but the guy who flew too close to the sun and got burned.
Oh, Icarus.
Icarus, exactly. Apparently that's not what it is. It's, and I have it written down here, it's showing Phaeton being stricken down by Zeus after losing control of his father's sun chariot, that he got too close to Earth, and that led to the creation of the desert.
Oh,
wow. So I think that's a nice touch.
Yeah. All those little details like that, again, if it's done in a movie and if it's done in a novel, or just adds an incredible layer.
Yeah. We're going to get criticized if we don't mention the match cut, which is another of maybe the most iconic moment of the film. We touched on it briefly earlier, where Dryden is giving him the assignment to go into the desert and find Prince Faisal, and he's holding a match. He says, it's going to be fun, and then he blows it out, and it immediately cuts to our introduction to the desert. And that's the most famous scene transition in film history. And I just think that moment, it's only a few seconds, but it just captures everything great about the film in such a short moment of Dryden as this interesting antagonist, Lawrence both thinking, this is going to be great, and then we've discussed the character arc a lot, but sort of his initial thinking, and then Dryden saying it's going to be like a fiery furnace, so we kind of know what to expect, and then cutting to the desert, which it's almost like the co-stars of the film are Peter O'Toole in the desert.
I absolutely I agree with that.
The two opponents who are going to be battling it out the entire time.
And
so the last thing I just want to mention, I know I said two things and it's become like 5 or 6 at this
That's
point,
okay.
The last thing I want to mention, and we'll get more into this as we kind of go through the rest of David Lean's epics, is the impact that this film had, not just on film, but on historical fiction in particular. That, as Martin Scorsese said, that David Lean invented kind of, quote, the intelligent epic. And I would almost compare it to the impact that Bob Dylan had on popular music. That in the 50s and early 60s, most songs were 2 to 3 minutes. They were built of 3 chords or so, and they were almost all kind of love songs meant for teenagers. As a kind of, that's kind of the basic. Think of I Want to Hold Your Hand by the Beatles or something like that. And then Bob Dylan kind of just emerges with, having conquered the folk genre with, much longer and deeper songs. One of the greatest ones being A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, about the aftermath of a nuclear war or something. And after meeting the Beatles, is convinced to go kind of, quote, go electric and go into rock. And so he brings folk music into rock, and particularly with a song like a Rolling Stone, reinvents popular music and brings a type of lyrical and intellectual depth into music that just explodes the norms of what that genre was, and paves the way for everything that came after, including Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys, Sgt. Pepper, just everything that came in the late 60s and 70s and everything else. So that was kind of Bob Dylan's impact, was redefining popular music. And I think David Lean's trilogy of epics, starting with Bridge on the River Kwai, which was like a stepping stone toward Lawrence of Arabia, which is sort of like the magnum opus in my view, and I think that's generally considered his greatest film.
Yeah.
And then we'll later get to Dr. Zhivago, but that trilogy of epics that brought this type of character depth into the historical epic and films just redefined the genre and helped pave the way for things like Schindler's List, Saving Private Ryan, 12 Years a Slave, and so many others.
Yeah,
and
so many.
That, in a way, that's almost David Lean's greatest
legacy. Yeah, definitely his legacy.
Okay, I know that was a lot.
No,
you want me to
it's
close
fine.
this out? Or?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So thank you all for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this week's episode. I believe we're taking next week off for the 4th of July.
Yes.
And we'll be back the following week. We're doing Dr. Zhivago next.
Yes,
right?
we are.
Yeah,
the next David Lean movie.
Yeah, so we're covering the epic trilogy we just discussed. And we started with Lawrence, and we're going to do Dr. Zhivago, and I suppose after that we'll do Bridge on the River Kwai.
Right, that sounds great.
Yeah, so we look forward to discussing that with you all. Keep making history and keep listening.
Watch the first part of this review to learn more about Lawrence of Arabia. Thank you for listening to the History Bards Historical Movie Reviews. Don't forget to click the subscribe button and follow us at our YouTube channel at the Historical Fiction Company or on Spotify.